ZiFM Stereo, my station, your station. It is a pleasure to have you tune in to us. My name is Farai Mwakutuya, and it's a very special edition of the platform because tonight we're speaking to perhaps the person of the moment in Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe's re-engagement process, or Zimbabwe's turnaround process, is hinged on its re-engagement with the international community, and a lot of that depends on the holding of free, fair, credible, and transparent elections. And the person, or the institution rather, that is tasked with doing that is the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. There's a new lady at its helm. She is Judge Priscilla Chigumba, and she is my guest today. Ma'am, a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for affording us this opportunity.
Thank you for having me.
Indeed. As I said, free, fair, credible, transparent elections have been promised by the new administration, and I suppose that is the mandate that you have been given. Having been in your position for a short period of time, how ready are you, how ready would you say ZEC is to deliver that?
ZEC is ready to deliver free, fair and credible elections and has already started the process of registration of voters. And I came in a little bit late in the program, but I'm very pleased with the fact that we have managed to register approximately 5,300,000 voters. Now remember, we had an old voters roll, and we're in the process of compiling a new voters roll, which for the first time in Zimbabwe actually captures a person's biometric features. So we're in the process now, after having conducted the initial registration exercise, of cleaning up the data or cleaning up the equipment, and we are moving on schedule, and I'm very pleased.
Just for clarity, because the minute we mentioned that we were hosting you on our program, a lot of people were sending in their questions and comments, and so for clarity, what is the status of the registration exercise? Is it still ongoing? Will there come a point where it will stop? Where are we?
The status of the current registration exercise is what ended on the 8th of February was the Blitz. And by Blitz we meant that we had a lot of registration centers which we ordinarily as ZEC we don't have. You know that voter registration is an ongoing exercise in terms of the Zimbabwean law. So what ended on the 8th of February was the registration Blitz, but voter registration is ongoing at our 9 provincial and 63 district offices. And what I have done for your purposes and for purposes of your listeners is to avail a list of the district offices and the telephone numbers, which information can also be obtained off our website. So just for your listeners to know that you now have a list of the ZEC district offices and provincial offices, and you can actually give out that information if you wish.
5.3 million voters, if I'm not mistaken. I think there was a target of about, or rather not a target, but I think the number of eligible voters had been projected at about 7 million. Is it a concern, or should it be a matter of concern that we seem to be quite a bit far off that?
There was a census predicted number of eligible voters, but the reason why I am pleased, or my team is pleased with 5.3 million, is that 5.3 million, firstly, is at least 70% of that census predicted number. And what we should also remember is part of that census predicted number includes people in the diaspora, of which we don't have a set number to say how many Zimbabweans are in the diaspora. It also includes people who are due to turn 18 years old sometime up to the end of 2018. But as you know, elections may not be held in December 2018, so they're actually people who will be eligible in 2018, but perhaps not eligible at the time that we actually go into elections. So we've, factoring in those numbers, 7 million we agreed and reduced it downwards to actually 5.5 million, which we thought was a realistic figure, having taken into consideration those people who might not be eligible at that date. Okay,
so what happens after, I mean, as you said, biometrics of this time round, features are being captured. What next? Will there come a time where people can actually go and inspect this, and when can we expect that to happen?
All right, as I said before, right now we're in the process of cleaning up the data, which involves weeding out double registrants, which involves correcting errors. Some people might have been allocated the wrong ward or the wrong polling station. Once the cleaning up exercise is done, we enter into a process which is called deduplication, where all that information is then uploaded into what is called the Automatic Finger Identification System, or AFIS. That AFIS process will take 6 to 8 weeks, whereafter we will produce a provisional voters roll, which will lie open for inspection for any period between 14 to 21 days. So Zimbabweans should know that there will come a time when they will be invited by ZEC to come and inspect the voters roll and see whether their names have been spelled correctly and whether their names actually are on the voters roll.
Indeed. Now I want to talk a bit about, you talk about, inspection, 14 to 21 day period, taking into account all those days and I suppose working backwards. In your view, when would we be ready to have elections? And I ask this purely because the Constitution prescribes a certain date, but we've been hearing indications that perhaps it could be earlier than that.
The Constitution, yes, the date of the election is prescribed in terms of the Constitution, but it is possible to work backwards and come up with a provisional date by which elections should be held. But in terms of the law, it is up to the President himself to proclaim the date of the Constitution. At ZEC, we've worked with the date when this current Parliament started sitting, the date when Parliament should dissolve itself, when its 5-year period expires. We've come up with a provisional date of sometime mid-July as a possible election date. Now I want to qualify that by saying it is up to the President to proclaim the election date, but he does so in terms of the law.
Let's talk about if he does proclaim a date that is before the timeline that you've mentioned as possible, or proclaims a date that you think or ZEC feels is not giving it adequate time to do so. Do you think that ZEC has the independence to be able to say, Mr. President, we can't do that. We think that we'll be ready on this date. Is ZEC empowered to do that, and is it possible to do that?
When I say that it is entirely within the President's discretion to proclaim the election date, he does do so in consultation with other stakeholders, and he will do so in consultation with ZEC through the Ministry of Justice, so that it's not a process whereby he proclaims a date when we're not ready.
Indeed. Now let's talk about going towards the elections. How possible is it to have this free, fair, transparent and credible election, given that whenever we speak to some opposition politicians, when we speak to civic society organizations, they talk about outstanding reforms, alignment of the electoral laws, for instance. Will all those things be done or implemented by the time we go to elections? And if not, are we still able to have a free and fair election?
Mandate which is given to ZEC in terms of the Constitution is to conduct free, fair and credible elections, which in my view means ZEC must conduct elections in accordance with the existing law. Now you're talking about reform, and I want to say that in terms of the ZEC mandate as well as set out in the Constitution and the Electoral Act, what we're required to do is to make recommendations. But your listeners should be advised that the laws are made by Parliament, which basically means it's up to Parliament to change the law. It's up to Parliament to align the law. We have currently made recommendations to Parliament through the Ministry of Justice as to the recommendations that we think, in our view, would align the electoral laws with the current Constitution. Whether or not those recommendations are going to find their way into the resultant bill really depends on parliamentary processes. And your viewers should also be advised that it is really up to their members of Parliament to make representations during the reading of the proposed electoral bill to ensure that whatever reforms they require find their way into law. So it's really up to the political parties themselves, because they're the ones who sit in Parliament, to make sure that the law is aligned. Once that is done at ZEC, we simply implement what Parliament will have decided.
Are you able to share some of the recommendations that you've made in terms of reform or alignment?
Well, in terms of reform or alignment, really our recommendations that we've made are more to do with procedural issues, such as the date by which registration, or the date by which the voters' roll really should be ready, the sitting of the nomination court, the receipt of the nominations. Our recommendations were more to do with procedural issues, which is because our role really is to ensure fairness in the process. So most of our recommendations were along those lines, but I do understand that there are the CSOs I'm not going to mention names, who've also made recommendations to Parliament. I understand the proposed electoral bill has actually been tabled before Parliament. I'm not sure whether it's gone to second sitting, but your viewers should be advised that if they wish to have any proposed changes accommodated in the bill, then through their members of Parliament, I'm sure their recommendations or wishes will find their way into the bill.
Talking about political parties, one of the things, and I suppose registration, this registration process as well, one of the things that has come under the spotlight, and on ZiFM we certainly have had programs about this, was the issue of potential or perceived intimidation, and this is by way of people being asked to avail numbers of their, their registration slips, the serial numbers. I've had programs where people called in and we couldn't verify or not, but people called in and said, look, our provincial administrator or chief or headman has called us, and tomorrow you must go and present these numbers. Are these things that ZEC, or clearly, as I'm sure, has heard about, but how are you dealing with that?
All right, in response to that question, I'm going to say three things.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is that intimidation is an offence in terms of the Electoral Act, and that your viewers should be advised that members of the public should really report such incidences, firstly to the Zimbabwe Republic Police, and secondly to the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission for investigation and prosecution of offenders. And viewers should also be, or your listeners should be advised that they should insist that any perpetrators be charged in terms of the Electoral Act, because some of its penalties are actually stiffer than the penalties that we have in terms of the normal criminal code. The second thing that I want to say, and please can your viewers listen carefully, the registration slip will not be used on polling day. So whether you've lost it, you washed your clothes and it's no longer clear, it has been demanded by the chief, the sabuku, the councillor, it will not be used on election day. All you need to do on election day is produce yourself and your national ID. The reason why that slip will not be used is because all your biometric features are already in the computer. So that registration slip, its importance has been blown up by certain people, as you say, because they're trying to intimidate voters, but voters should be advised that even if you turn up without that slip, you will not be turned away. You'll be allowed to vote if you have your national ID. And if you are who you say you are, you should be allowed to vote. So in terms of whether or not that slip has been used to demand certain things, like I said, there are already laws in place which voters can utilize in order to get that sort of thing to stop. The third thing that I want to say is that at ZEC, we are of the view that continuing voter education is actually a tool that we can use in order to correct some of these misconceptions. So for instance, I've already educated voters that they shouldn't worry about the voter registration slip because it will not be used on election day. Now we have political party liaison committees. We sit on those liaison committees. They are at a provincial level, even down to district levels. We sit down, we encourage political parties to talk. Political parties themselves actually have a code of conduct where they have agreed that this is how we conduct elections. So we use continuous voter education, we use stakeholder engagement, and then we encourage use of the law or use of the Human Rights Commission for those cases that require legal intervention or for the courts or for the law to come in.
Are there enough or adequate resources to be able to allow ZEC to undertake this continuous education that you talk about?
Unfortunately, when it comes to resources, we had submitted a budget of something like 104 million to Treasury. Treasury committed themselves to availing 98 million, which leaves us with a deficit of about 83 billion. Currently, during the biometric voter registration exercise, we experienced challenges. There are daily allowances which are due to be paid to our election officers. Those allowances were cut from $55 to $30 to $20. And we mostly had people who were affected in the rural areas, such as Mbire, because if you give a person in Mbire $20 and you ask them to move from point A to point B, that is insufficient. So in terms of resources, we are undercapacitated, and we are hoping that government, together with our other funding partners, will make up the deficit. And we continue to engage with government, and government continues through Treasury, I must acknowledge, to do their best in these difficult economic circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Will that not, I suppose it's a question we must ask, that what sort of an impact will this shortage of resources have on delivering these elections? And I want to point out some of the allegations we hear are, and I suppose because of those reductions in allowances, where some people who were doing this registration kept turning people away and telling them to come back the following day so they could have more days that they are working and therefore more allowances. So how have you been dealing with those potential issues where people could have been prejudiced, it could have affected people who wanted to register, for instance? Are these things that you've heard about?
I don't want to comment on speculation and conjecture. My response to that is, whichever voter experienced that sort of thing ought to have reported that to the relevant authorities and or ZEC. We do have toll-free lines, which I've actually also availed in that information pack, where anyone who's aggrieved by any of our processes should actually call our toll-free line, which is manned 24 hours, and report such malpractices. I must hasten to add that the cutting of the allowances did affect the morale of our staff, but I would not like to think, given the training that we gave our people on the ground, that that was the reason why people were actually turned away and told to come back the next day. I know that during the Blitz, that our offices were actually inundated in some instances with extremely large numbers of people who, as Zimbabwean citizens, in their wisdom, decided to leave it until the last day to come and register to vote. So I really don't want to condemn any of our officers unless and until I have a credible report from someone with actual evidence to say this particular officer turned me away at 3 p.m. and said that I should come back the following day.
Indeed. The independence of ZEC, is that something that, we often hear from different sections of society, accusations that ZEC is not entirely independent. Would you like to comment on that?
ZEC is independent, and the reason why I say so is because its independence is guaranteed in terms of Section 253 of the Constitution. The fact that we are appointed by a certain authority certainly doesn't affect our independence. All the commissioners, the ZEC commissioners, myself included as chair, we took oaths to uphold the independence of ZEC. Its independence is guaranteed in terms of the Constitution, and I don't see any conflict or problem, because what we simply have to do is administer the law. Remember, ZEC is just an umpire. It's not an interested party, but it acknowledges that it is in the interest of Zimbabweans that Zimbabweans be allowed to choose leaders of their choice. We don't interfere with the choice. Our job is simply to be an umpire and to ensure that there's fairness in the processes.
We hear that there's, security agents or security staff within the institution. Does that affect at all this independence, perhaps? Maybe this is where these allegations are coming from.
Before I became chairperson of ZEC, I was actually concerned about the same thing, because I would continuously read about that in the media. But since I became chairperson of ZEC, in the 9 or 10 days that I've been sitting in this chair, I've not found any evidence which I can rely on to say that currently they are serving members of the security sector employed by ZEC. Remember, the law, our law, the Zimbabwean law, allows ZEC to recruit anyone who's retired from wherever they were serving before, for as long as they're qualified for that position. So I've been advised that there are no serving members of the security sector amongst our employees. And I would urge any listener or voter who has knowledge that there's a serving member of the security sector who's employed by ZEC to come forward now while we're in the pre-election phase, so that corrective measures can be taken, because that is a situation which is undesirable for anyone. If we do have retired members of the security sector, our law doesn't preclude us from recruiting such.
Indeed. I want to come back to the issue of voter education and perhaps just ask you a question where, I think for some people, it's unfortunate that the background and the history that we're coming from, election time means, for lack of a better term, war. That we must now go out and intimidate people and beat people up and all these sort of things. And there are some people who believe that, unfortunately, or seem to believe that. And as much as the president may say, let's have a free and fair election, let's not be violent, and as much as you're saying that everything is in place to deliver a free and fair election, it may still be marred by people like that. How do we change that mindset, and do you have a plan to do that?
It is my considered view, and this is a personal opinion, by the way, that previous elections which were marred by violence, that was a result of polarization in our political playing field. And as ZEC, what we're saying is, it is the duty of the political parties themselves even to not only restrain their members in their political parties, but also disseminate the information to their members that violence is not permissible in terms of the election. They should also preach tolerance. We're doing our bit as ZEC to disseminate that information and to try and dislodge the perception that elections must be violent. I think it's lack of knowledge and lack of education around election processes, which we're working very hard with the assistance of the CSOs, the FBOs, and even political parties themselves, as I said, through the political parties liaison committees, which we found quite useful. We also have continuous engagements, I believe every quarter, with all those organizations, political parties, CSOs, FBOs, other stakeholders, with the ZEC chair herself and the commissioners, where we sit down and we discuss topical issues. What is topical? What is happening? Remember, our commissioners are responsible for different districts, Blawayo, Matibela, North, South. I myself am actually directly responsible for Harare. I'm not inviting your listeners to start inundating me with telephone calls, but just to say my supervisory division is Harare Metropolitan. So some of the complaints come to me. I participate in some of the stakeholder engagement processes. And I believe we really need to, as Zimbabweans ourselves, decide that we do not want to have elections marred by violence, and to assist each other to be politically tolerant to each other's views and policies. There's really no need to beat each other up. A Zimbabwean person should be able to vote for the person who best represents them. And as soon as we disseminate that information and it is understood, then there really would be no need for violence. So it's a joint effort by ZEC and the political parties themselves and our other stakeholders. And if we continue along the path that we're seeing now, I'm quite encouraged that this time around there might be less violence than before.
Have you had an opportunity to meet some of the leaders or members of the political parties just to find out what their feelings, concerns, and where they are in terms of this election?
I think I had been in office for 3 days when I actually had an engagement with political parties. It was more along the lines of the commissioners introducing me to the stakeholders. As you know, Zimbabwe now has over 95 registered political parties. I had a meeting with them. I was quite encouraged. What I did at that meeting was that there were reports in the media of alleged political violence against one of the leaders. And I took the opportunity to actually condemn such acts and to remind the political parties that we were in this together and that we needed each other in order to see this country and take it forward, and to actually ask them to disseminate the information regarding the registration slip and also disseminate relevant information to their members about being tolerant towards each other's views. It was a good meeting. We had a good Q&A after, and I had one political party that had been registered for a month wanting to know when they were going to get the money from ZEC. And we took the opportunity to disseminate to them that no, political parties are actually paid in terms of the law, and only if they have a member of parliament actually currently sitting in parliament. I must say they were quite disappointed.
And so maybe their month-long existence may, we'll see how it goes, or perhaps may motivate them to get an MP.
Yeah.
Again, talking about the political parties, that Q&A, do you think that it was enough to clear the air, to set the record straight, and I suppose to build the relationships that you're looking for? Because there are some people who constantly attack and criticize. Do you think that that was an opportunity, and that you were able to perhaps convince these political parties that indeed you are impartial and can deliver an election?
I'm sure I can't speak for the political parties. It is up to them to say how they perceive the intervention that I did at that stage. But I was actually quite happy at that stage to have the opportunity to allow them to get to know me, as it were. As I say, I was introduced to them by the commissioners as the incoming chair, and I got a positive vibe from them. I indicated firstly that I have an open door policy. I indicated that I am open to continuous and further engagement with them. I indicated to them that anything that they feel should be brought to my attention, promptly, and undertook that I would address their concerns in any way that I can within my capability promptly. And as an overture of trying to present myself to them as a person who is determined that elections at least be credible and free and fair. It was a fairly good shot, but it's up to them really to say whether they were convinced or not. I can't tell whether they were convinced. I'd like to believe they were.
Okay. We're going to talk a bit more about the elections, about what happens when we head into election season proper. We're going to take some comments that have come to us via our social media platforms, because Zimbabweans are obviously very interested and have vested interest in these elections, and we've reached out to them and they have comments, questions and contributions that they've sent through, and we'll be posting them to you, Judge Chigumba, very shortly. We're going to take a short break on ZiFM Stereo. It is the platform. Our guest tonight is none other than the Chairperson of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, Justice Priscilla Chigumba. Do stay tuned. We'll be back very shortly. Welcome back. It is ZiFM Stereo, my station, your station. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. My guest tonight is the Chairperson of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, Justice Priscilla Chigumba. And as I promised, we're going to take some comments and contributions that are coming through from our listeners via Twitter. It was a very interesting one, interesting question that has come through, but I'm going to read it as it is. We've got Ashley getting in touch and saying, is it true that this year's election is going to be free and fair? But I think the question I really want to pick up on here is, and also, are they going to be international observers? So perhaps you could speak to us here about, we've heard the President say he is open to international observers. They are elections must be observed anyway, so perhaps speak to us about the process of who should come and observe and how they get accredited.
I'll take the question in two parts. The first part of the question is it true that this year's elections are going to be free and fair? That's a loaded question, and the reason why I say so is if I answer with a simple yes, then it might imply that I myself believe that past elections were not free and fair. And to be fair to past administrators of electoral processes, I don't want to say that past elections were not free and fair. To be fair, the only election where there was a delay in the announcement of the presidential results was in 2008. The administration then gave a credible explanation as to how that came about. They had to recount the votes, they had to transport ballot boxes. Whether or not their explanation was acceptable to Zimbabwean citizens and the public is not for me to say. But what I want to say is that going forward, what I want to say to the Zimbabwean people is we at ZEC are making best efforts that the 2018 harmonized elections are free, fair and credible. The second part of your question regarding accreditation of observers is that anything and everything to do with electoral processes starts and ends and is guided by the law. Now, we have regulations which were put in place in 2008 which govern the conduct of the accreditation process. In terms of those regulations, the accreditation process starts when the election date is actually promulgated by the President. So there's a stipulated time period after which the accreditation committee should sit. The accreditation committee comprises of ZEC, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, immigration officials. And what we do at ZEC is once the election date has been proclaimed, we then, through the media, usually through an advert, we invite those people who wish to be accredited to observe our elections to submit their applications to the accreditation committee. Their applications are considered by the accreditation committee and they are accredited after payment of a nominal fee.
What, a listener here getting in touch, this is Emmanuel Dongo, what do you intend to do differently from your predecessors to deliver a credible election? Perhaps let me put that a different way and say, look, do you feel or have you felt that there's a need to shake things up here at ZEC, or you found an institution that was quite well equipped and poised, positioned to deliver its mandate?
Well, if your listener could allow me to qualify my answer by saying, again, I do not wish to be taken to be discrediting past processes or past administrators of electoral processes. So in terms of what do I feel I should do differently. The mandate of ZEC is simply to administer the law as it is, and I believe that what will happen differently this time is if our current electoral laws are aligned with the new constitution, the 2013 constitution, then quite obviously these elections are going to be different from any other elections that we've held in Zimbabwe, not because of what I have done personally, but because the law has changed. Because remember, we simply go back to the starting point that at ZEC we are an umpire and we are guided by the law and we follow the law and we simply administer the election. It is also really up to the Zimbabwean people themselves to decide to have a peaceful election. Quite obviously, if people on the ground are assaulting each other, they can decide to shake hands and say sorry and not assault each other. They can decide to coexist and send out their electoral messages together under a tree. So it's really up to ZEC, but it's also up to Zimbabweans ourselves. We ourselves, I believe, should decide that this time around we want an election where we make a choice of our leaders based on policies, and we want to allow politicians to put their policies across without having us as Zimbabwean citizens actually beat each other for no reason. We can actually decide ourselves to be tolerant towards each other and to be tolerant to different views.
Another listener via Twitter enchanting says, free, fair and credible elections, please don't be used by those who appointed you, nor be promised dollars in the range of billions by those wanting to come in. Just be fair and let events take their course. Now I want to link this to the point that you mentioned where I think you had asked for $104 million to conduct the elections. Unfortunately, because of constraints, you've been allocated $98 million. You've spoken about, having to reduce allowances amongst other things. What are the safeguards you're putting in place to ensure that where morale is low, for instance, or where money allowances aren't what people would expect, that those people are not then manipulated by those who may be willing to offer a little bit extra or what they want to get what they want, basically?
It is my belief that our funding deficit or our funding challenge is a temporary thing. Because remember, we're still in the pre-election phase. We're going to go into the election phase, which is a period between the proclamation of the election date and polling and the announcement of the results, and we're going to go into the post-election phase. So that budget of 104 million is actually a budget that cuts across that whole pre-election, post-election period. So what we're expecting is Treasury has committed to 98, but we expect Treasury to release more funds. Because as you know, we've had economic challenges, and Treasury is well aware of the fact that in terms of the Constitution, it is the duty of the government of Zimbabwe to fund our electoral processes. So we expect more money to come from Treasury itself. And then also traditionally, we have funding partners who will come in, and all the funding partners are aware of the budget deficit. And I fully expect that by the time we get to the inspection of the voters' roll, we will somehow have at least addressed the funding deficit for the election period itself, if not for the post-election period.
Previous elections, certainly we know that there have been observer missions, that they have made recommendations. I'm not sure if in the time that you've been in this office you've had an opportunity to have sight of them, but I would perhaps want to know to what extent some of those recommendations have now been implemented in this coming election. I'm not sure if at this stage you're able to comment on that.
Some of the recommendations, yes, have certainly been taken on board where they were purely administrative, but where those recommendations require a change in the law, as I've said, we've made relevant recommendations. One particular intervention that I could mention at this stage was the contentious issue of assisted voting. Remember, that was quite contentious, perhaps assisted voting of visually challenged voters. I was given the example that what happens in an instance where a voter comes in and they have no arms, but they wish to be registered to vote. Their biometric features can actually be taken without their fingerprints having to be taken, provided they have a national ID. Then the question becomes, what happens on voting day? Should that person be assisted by an election officer? If so, which election officer? Do we need to have 3 observers from each political party in the voting booth as this challenged person is voting? Should the law then prescribe and say that this voter should be assisted by a member of the ZRP, which then brings into question whether that member is not going to intimidate this person?
Yeah.
So we're working on interventions around that, and we should see some relevant changes in the law to put forward processes that are acceptable to all the political parties. As I said, when the bill is debated in Parliament, it's up to members of Parliament to see that what comes out of there is something that is workable and that is fair to everyone.
To the extent that some of those provisions obviously haven't been implemented, but to what extent during the current registration exercise have people who are physically challenged, for instance, been accommodated or been facilitated to be able to ensure that they're not left out?
We have, amongst our voter educators, we actually have shall I say, people who are challenged visually and otherwise, who are actually part of our team that does voter education. And we've had a very successful intervention where people who are actually similarly challenged actually prefer to sit down with someone similar and be given voter education. So those are some of the interventions that we took. But also, as part of the BVR registration exercise, we had accredited observers. So anyone who wished to observe, whether they were political parties, CSOs, we actually accredited observers, diplomats even, for the BVR exercise, and they were actually able to look and see what ZEC was doing during the registration exercise. We are yet to receive their reports on how they have reviewed our conduct or what we did during that exercise. We fully expect those reports to contain recommendations as to where, in their view, there were some gaps, so that we then plug those holes before the actual polling day.
I want to talk about now, and I suppose this goes back to the issue of education. We've heard, again, accusations that some influential people, traditional chiefs for instance, are being used or are conducting themselves in a partisan manner. Is that something that you're concerned about, or how is that something you are looking into or looking to address?
We're looking to address it. As I said, our political party liaison committees go right down to district levels. So it's not just people in Harare talking in Harare. We've got those liaison committees. We've tried to disseminate information to say to people, go and report to the Human Rights Commission, go and report to the police. These are actually offences in terms of the Electoral Act. We are due for an intervention with chiefs, because remember, some of the allegations were that the chiefs were demanding, especially the BVR registration slips in return for rice and other things. We are looking into it, and we are conducting continuous stakeholder engagement, and we fully expect that by the time we enter the actual election period, we will have eradicated most of those things.
Some people may say that the damage, or the ground has already been set, the intimidation has already been done. So even if we address it, it's already been done. It might be too late.
I would encourage our voters to take a more optimistic view. I know that the perception on the ground is marred by what may or may not have happened in the past, or by what may or may not have happened in the past. I also implore the media to actually report responsibly, because in some instances we find that upon investigation what will actually have been reported in the media is actually an allegation that has no substance or proof. So my direct answer to the question whether the die is already cast, my answer is it's never too late to tell a voter not to be afraid to come out and vote on voting day. It's never too late. And we will continue to ensure that voters are not intimidated by disseminating information.
What about, and let me begin by saying that we obviously can't tell what's going to happen in the forthcoming election or in the future. But in the past, some people have raised concerns that some of the institutions to which you are directing them to report their concerns are compromised or have not acted on those reports. So to put it bluntly, some people have said, look, we've gone and reported to ZRP, for instance, but no action has been taken because it's perceived that the people who are perpetrating these offenses are untouchable or aligned to certain political parties. In such cases where I would imagine that it's not going to happen, but if it does, where does a person go? If they've reported but no action is taken, or they're told, we can't do anything about this person who you're reporting.
What I know is that the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission itself actually has members of the ZRP that they are in direct consultation with when these cases are reported to them. So really, if there's anyone, a Zimbabwean citizen, a voter, who reported a matter and nothing transpired, that's why we refer them to both the Human Rights Commission and the police, because those are the organizations or the institutions that have investigative powers. Unfortunately, at ZEC, we don't have an investigative mandate. Ours is to recommend, ours is to educate, ours is to blow the whistle where we see that there's unfairness happening on the ground. So we still refer them back to say, go back and say, I reported on such and such a date at such and such a police station, but to perhaps report even to the Human Rights Commission as a check and balance against perceived inaction by the ZRP, as it were.
I am sure if you haven't already, I would imagine ZRP and such partners are some of the institutions that you will also be spreading this message to and meeting and engaging. Is that on the cards?
They are our stakeholder, yes, and we work closely with them.
Election time, and quite a number of people again have come through on social media. It's something that political opposition, political parties have cried foul over. When an election is declared, you effectively take over things such as, the media. And so how will you ensure that there's equal access to media towards an election?
All right. We have a media monitoring committee, which is currently chaired by our Commissioner Kazembe. That media monitoring committee is, again, as with all electoral processes, governed by the law. And the law is very specific on what that committee may or may not do. We have other members of that committee, actually the Media Commission, the Broadcasting Authority of Zimbabwe is a member of that commission. And the job of that commission really is just to look at whether or not public media space is being shared equally between the parties. It also superintends complaints. Say a political party has a complaint about being denied space, they take that complaint to the Media Monitoring Committee. Unfortunately, in terms of the law, that committee only kicks in after the election day has been proclaimed by the President. So in effect, that committee kicks in once we are in the election period. So the election period is proclamation of election date up to the announcement of the results. That's the election period. We are currently in the pre-election period, and that committee has not yet kicked in.
How do you remedy a scenario where I am candidate X, I have not been granted space on state broadcasters or in state media, I take my complaint to the committee, and effectively, the state media or whoever it is ignores it or doesn't allow me the space even after those complaints, to what effect? Because I would imagine after the election I'm still aggrieved, but I'm sure people will turn around and say, oh, okay, sorry, next time we'll make sure we do a better job. How do you ensure that these committees have teeth, that they actually act timeously and to address these real concerns? Because after an election is done, and so you'll say, okay, we didn't give you enough coverage or as much coverage as we should have, but it's done. An election has been lost.
All right. Well, in terms of the regulations that govern the conduct of this committee, or which give it its terms of reference, all complaints are supposed to be addressed within a 48-hour period, taking into consideration the fact that time might be of the essence when someone is campaigning. And also ultimately, if there is perceived lack of effectiveness or perceived lack of willingness to comply with what the committee will have come up with, the ultimate authority on electoral processes is the Electoral Court, which is a division of the High Court. So you can actually sue or take whatever it is, whichever institution is denying you your right, which has been approved by that committee, you take it to the Electoral Court and obtain a court order.
So the process is the Electoral Court arbitrates.
That's the ultimate.
Okay.
Yes.
That's the ultimate. Can we see, is ZEC empowered to do, for instance, I'll use this example of, I think, the last election in Zambia, where because of a flare-up in violence, particularly in Lusaka, the Electoral Commission banned campaigning for 10 days to allow people to cool off and things like that. Does our Electoral Commission here have those powers to be able to take such an action? For instance, say, in this case, newspaper X or broadcaster X, you do this or else perhaps we're shutting you down for this period, or no political advertising? Is that something that you can do?
ZEC is empowered to make recommendations to the relevant bodies that have the powers to do so. That's the short answer.
Okay, thank you so much for that and for clearing that up. But I'm glad you said you've got an open door policy, and I'm sure the political parties are listening and will hopefully come forward and address these issues. I want to talk again now, perhaps just in terms of coming back to this issue of independence of ZEC. What sort of, when you were appointed, when the president engaged you and you took up this appointment, what assurances, or did you get assurances that indeed you are independent, that there would be no political interference or pressure brought to bear, that you are truly independent?
Well, the first thing to correct is that the president did not engage me.
Okay.
The process actually involves a consultation between the president and the Judicial Service Commission, and a consultation between the recommendations made by the Judicial Service Commission with a committee of parliament. Mm-hmm. And what it is really is that for my purposes, I simply get a notification from the Judicial Service Commission to say you have been nominated and you're due to be appointed on such and such a day. So there was no direct engagement between myself personally and the president. Mm-hmm. Being a judge, really, I don't need assurances from anyone that I'm going to be independent. I know what the law permits me to do, and I'm perfectly capable of interpreting the law and applying it. And what it involves really is my willingness or my ability, where I'm being interfered with, to blow the whistle and say, stop interfering with me, and carry on with the job that I'm mandated to do. I don't really need the president to talk me up to say, you are going to be independent. I am independent because the law allows you to be independent, and I'm capable of interpreting the law.
Indeed. Well, it's great to hear, and I'm sure many Zimbabweans would love, are welcoming those sort of sentiments, and we certainly look forward to that happening. I want to talk a bit about diaspora vote. It's been a very topical issue, and I think there are processes before the courts.
Yes.
What happens in the event that the court rules or allows it to happen, given the time, given the logistics? What implications would that have? I
don't want to preempt matters which are sub judice, but all I can say is we've had a previous court order, if you remember, so-called aliens, or people whose identity particulars were endorsed alien, were not allowed to vote. And that was challenged before the courts. And the courts then said to us, well, ZEC, we are instructing you and directing you to register these people. And that was the reason why the BVR process was then extended by a month to enable us and allow us to do so. So whatever guidance is going to come from the Constitutional Court, we will simply follow the directive that the court has given us. If we're directed by the court to register people in the diaspora, we have no option but to follow the court order. Mm-hmm. And we will register if we are so directed. I will hasten to add that the reason why at the moment we are unable to register people in the diaspora to vote is not because of discrimination. There's been some misrepresentation in the public media. Mm-hmm. It is actually the law in Zimbabwe which says that a person who's registered to vote must be registered to vote in a specific ward and be allocated a specific polling station. Now, unfortunately, London, Vienna, Geneva are not wards in Zimbabwe. That's the reason why we are unable to register people in the diaspora so that they can vote from the diaspora. What we are able to do is to register those people in the diaspora who come home, provide proof of residence in a certain ward, allocate them a polling station, and if they present themselves in that ward at that polling station on voting day, they can register to vote. So to a certain extent, it's incorrect to say we don't allow people in the diaspora to vote. Our law says they must come home and register to vote in their ward. Now, if the Constitutional Court gives guidance that that law be changed, then that law will have to be changed. And if the law is changed, ZEC merely will apply the law.
as we head towards wrapping up, there are a few things that I think are very important that we recap on. And I say this because I always like to say, let's not take anything for granted. And this is a great opportunity for us to educate and to raise awareness. That issue that you've just been talking about now, polling station-based voting. A lot of people, I'm sure, well, not a lot of people, but some people may have gone to register to vote and you know, selected a polling station, whereas they've traditionally voted somewhere else. I think it's important that you stress now that it's polling station based. So where you've registered is where you go to vote. The polling station you've selected. I think that's very important to point out to our listeners.
And might I just say that during the BVR process, you will have noticed when you went through it that the minute your biometric features were taken and your proof of residence and your address, the computer itself actually allocated you a polling station. And then you were advised by the registering officer that your polling station is such and such, isn't it? Now, during the inspection of the voters' roll, this is your opportunity to actually physically verify whether indeed, firstly, you are registered to vote, whether your names are spelled correctly, and whether you know the actual polling station that you have been allocated in terms of the computer, so that you present yourself there. Now, remember, you could register to vote in Blair, but you needed to provide proof of residence. So you registered to vote in Blair, but you live in Bari. The computer would actually tell you that according to your address, your polling station is in Bari, even though you had registered in Blair. Now, if during the inspection of the voters' roll, it so happens that you've been transferred by your employer to Blair and you're now working in Mudzi, when you inspect your name in the voters' roll, it's actually up to you to go and provide proof of residence that you're now based in Mudzi and you're likely to be voting from Mudzi as opposed to Mbare, and it's actually possible, provided you satisfy the proof of residence requirements, that your polling station can then be transferred during that period from Mbare to Mudzi, where you will be. So that is the purpose of that inspection period. You can actually change your address, which will change your polling station. However, if you are in Kotwa on polling day and you're supposed to be voting in Umguza, you will not be able to vote because voting is polling station based.
Indeed. Good point. This inspection of the voters' roll, I'm sure people would love for it to be as you did with the Blitz, to take it to the people. I'm not sure if you'll be able to do that. Most likely, where will it be done so people can prepare themselves and also are aware that, you know what, it's important. You may have registered and take it for granted that you're registered, but you don't want to turn up on election day and discover that maybe your name is spelled wrong and things like that. So how widely will you take it?
It will be nationwide, and we will do voter education awareness campaigns to the same level, or if not to up our game to even better levels than we did for the BVR exercise. That information will be disseminated to members of the public in due course, because it is actually part of our mandate to produce a voters' roll that is credible. And the credibility of the voters' roll depends on the acceptance of the voters' roll by the voters. So, for instance, if for some reason there are double registrations, we should be able to weed them out before the provisional voters' roll. If there are corrections to be made and they're pointed out to us during the inspection period, we should be able to attend to those corrections before the production of a final voters' roll, which will only be gazetted if it is acceptable to all the stakeholders. After the gazetting of the voters' roll, that's when we expect a proclamation on the election date. Before you wind up, might I just emphasize two things with your permission? The first thing is that Zimbabwean voters, please be advised that the registration certificate, the voter registration certificate, is not required on voting day. You won't need that certificate to vote. All you need is your ID. So please, that's very important. We should tell each other, we should tell Vana Gogo, we should tell whoever is being intimidated, Gumusha, that you don't need it. If you remember,
but more importantly, that you don't need it, but no one should ask you for those details anyway.
Yes, and if you've been asked for it, it's been taken away, please don't worry about it, other than reporting to the relevant authorities, because it is an offense if intimidation accompanied it. I'm being told, to be fair, in all fairness, that some political parties themselves are the ones who have been asking some of their members to say, come to party headquarters, we want your voter registration slip serial number so that they can do their own internal processes to say how many of our members have registered to vote.
And do their projections.
So there is that as well. So
Okay.
in all fairness, those reports have actually come to us. Some political parties are rewarding their members for voting with rice and other
Registering,
things.
yeah.
To say you're a member of X political party, where's your serial number? Here's 5 kgs of rice. We don't interfere with internal party processes as long as they're done within party headquarters and no member of the public is being intimidated or inveigled. So members of the public, Zimbabwean voters, please be advised, if you've lost your voter registration slip, if someone has taken it, if someone has written down the serial number, that information cannot be used to determine where you vote, how you vote, who you vote for, and the loss of that certificate or the recording of that number is irrelevant to your ability to vote on voting day.
There's one more point I want you to stress, but before you do that, another question that's come through from our listeners is this voters' roll, because it's all biometric now. I'd imagine, and even when it wasn't, I'm sure it's being kept somewhere. It's protected somewhere. There are servers that you have. Are these places that, for instance, observers, political parties will also have access to say, look, this is where our voters' roll is, safeguarded?
All right. I believe political parties have already had a tour of all the servers that were previously acquired by ZEC before the start of the process. And I would also like to assure the voters that all the data and equipment is encrypted. So there's not likely to be any possibility of tampering with the data. And also the place where we keep the servers here is actually under heavy security. I've tested the security features myself in my 9 or 10 days in office, and I can assure Zimbabwean voters that we take the responsibility seriously here at ZEC to secure and safeguard where that equipment is and where that information is.
Very lastly, before we wrap up, what's ended is the registration blitz, but registration is ongoing.
Yes, that was the second thing that I was going to ask you to allow me to tell our voters. What ended was the voter registration blitz, but voter registration is an ongoing exercise in terms of our constitution and in terms of our electoral law. The only difference between now and the blitz is that you may only register to vote at our 9 provincial and 63 district offices. And the information pertaining to the district offices may be found on the ZEC website and or in that information pamphlet which I've given to you. And we expect voter registration to continue up to 12 days after the nomination court sits. Whereafter, if you register after that date, you will not find your name on the 2018 voters roll, but your name might be on the next voters roll.
Indeed. I just wanted to take an opportunity here to read out these toll-free numbers because I think it's very important. Well, I don't see the toll-free numbers here, but I can certainly tell you that you can get in touch with ZEC inquiry at zec.gov.zw. Some of the numbers that I have here are 77, this is a Harare number, 774095, 759130, 779618. So please feel free to come to any of these district offices. Information will be disseminated here on ZiFM. Ask questions. I mean, it's your opportunity. Register to vote. Don't be intimidated. Have your opportunity to have your say and participate in the next elections.
And if I might add, if you are intimidated, report to the Zimbabwe Republic Police and or to the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission for investigation.
Indeed. Justice Priscilla Chigumba, it's been a pleasure having you on the program. Allow me to say that I think it's a great start in terms of engaging with the media. I think one of the things that certainly as a media practitioner and speaking to various colleagues that we've bemoaned about ZEC was the lack of openness and accessibility. So we thank you for this opportunity and look forward to it continuing now into the election, beyond that, and going forward.
Thank you, and just to say as a final word, Zimbabweans, it is our election. It is our time to choose our leaders of choice. Let us participate in the process.
Thank you so much. Pleasure. Once again, ZiFM Stereo, my station, your station. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a special edition of the platform. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. My guest has been Justice Priscilla Chigumba, Chairperson of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. If you haven't already registered to vote, please go and do so. Stay tuned to ZiFM Stereo, my station, your station.